All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the 2022 SLU Summit for Water. My name is Rachel Rimmerman, and I'm the Director of Business and Outreach for the SLU Water Institute. And it is such a pleasure to join you all today and have you all here with us for World Water Day. I'm very excited to introduce this next session. It is a research presentation given by Dr. Jason Knouft. And it is about COVID-19 and freshwater resources, an example of how climate change can serve as a threat multiplier. Dr. Knouft is unable to be with us today, so it is a pre-recorded presentation, but he has offered his email address in case anyone has questions about the research or wants to connect with him personally, and I will include that in the chat, so you will be able to follow up with him and reach out to him if you want to discuss anything further that he shares today. Dr. Knouft is currently serving as a Jefferson Science Fellow at the U.S. Department of State in D.C., serving as a climate and water analyst. He is also a primary investigator with the Water Institute, a professor of biology in the College of Arts and Sciences here at St. Louis University, and a scientist and large river ecologist for the National Great Rivers Research and Education Center. So we're very lucky to have him as part of our team, and we're excited to share his research with you today. So I will go ahead and launch that video. Thanks again for joining us. And again, I will share his email in the chat, and you're welcome to reach out to him with any further questions.
Hi, my name is Dr. Jason Knouft, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Biology and a member of the Water Institute. And I greatly appreciate the opportunity to speak to everybody today about the relationship between COVID-19 and climate change and freshwater resources. And I also greatly appreciate the help of Rachel Rimmerman and the Water Institute allowing me to record this talk because I'm unable to be there with you in person or virtually in person today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and see if we can get things going here. Okay. Okay, great. So again, what I'd like to talk about today is COVID-19 and freshwater resources, and particularly talking about how climate change can serve as a threat multiplier. And so the first thing I'll do is talk about COVID-19 and actually, well, I'm going to start out talking about climate and talk about, what a threat multiplier is and what that actually means in the context of climate change and COVID-19. So generally speaking, climate change is, back in 2014, climate change was described as a threat multiplier by the Department of Defense because it has the potential to exacerbate other drivers of insecurity. And so by insecurity, we can think about economic risks. So as climate changes, we might see failure of infrastructure on which economic activity depends. There's societal risk, which is where we see risks related to social stability. And then we've got geopolitical risks where we have disputes over resources. And so any one of these risks can lead to political instability. And so it is that political instability which is really the result of this climate change being a threat multiplier. And so, we don't necessarily think of political instability as a direct outcome of climate change impacts, but what we expect is going to happen is that climate change is going to affect either geopolitical or social or economic infrastructure which then will result in instability in social systems, which then leads to political instability. And then it's that political instability that really is the end point of concern. And so as of March 15th, 2022, based on the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center, there have been 461 million documented COVID-19 cases since the pandemic began, and just over 6 million deaths attributed to COVID-19. And so, I don't know a good way to put such an unbelievably horrible number into context, but that is about the population of the state of Missouri. And so it's just when you take a step back, it's really mind-boggling to think of what those numbers look like. But in the middle of the pandemic, before we started seeing vaccines rolling onto the stage as a source of mitigation of the pandemic, the United Nations came out and just really pointed out that hand hygiene is essential to containing the spread of COVID-19, as well as many other diseases. And so, really one of the most important things and best things we can do is wash our hands, right? And I remember, as the pandemic was really ramping up, you can recall all the instructions you would see on TV or in the news or wherever about how long you should wash your hands, how you should wash your hands. When our kids came home, after being outside or whatever, we'd always say, go in and wash your hands. And so that was like the thing everybody could do to have a really important impact on the transmission of COVID. And so being able to wash your hands is dependent on having water and fresh and clean water and access to that water. So when water resources are stressed or unpredictable, then we see an avenue for further transmission of COVID-19. And so it was in March 2020 when the World Health Organization provided guidelines for the prevention of COVID-19, and hand washing and things like physical distancing and household cleaning were all part of these guidelines. And I'll get to why those are particularly important in the context of water soon. So, the access to clean water is a problem in all parts of the world, but it's really been an ongoing and extreme in less developed regions. And there have been significant health implications resulting from this lack of access during the COVID-19 pandemic. So in the context of climate change, the local and global impacts of COVID-19, while they're unusual on their own, they've occurred on an even more unusual warming planet. So the climate is changing in a way that it never has before. And in particular, stressing our water resources, even more so than they already are in current areas. And so, this is a result, obviously, of increases in air temperature and changes in precipitation. And so the result is we've got changing patterns of water storage and stress around the world. And so this is a map from Huggins et al. 2022 in Nature Communications. And if you notice in the bottom left here, you've got this bivariate key where you've got a range of freshwater storage. And these are aquifers and surface waters where we see drying or on the left side and increasing or on the right side. And then on this sort of y-axis, you see freshwater stress. And so this also sort of implies how impactful these decreases in storage are. So, you could imagine if you had 2 buckets of water and one bucket lost or had a cup of water in it, and the other bucket had 100 cups of water in it. If you took half a cup out of each one of those buckets, the water supply in one of the buckets would be more stressed than the other. So you can have decreases in storage that are similar, but the amount of water sort of in the area is what defines the stress in the context of those changes in storage. And so what you can see over here in the Middle East and in Central Asia, parts of the Western US, down in parts of South America, the red and pink areas are where we see highly stressed regions, and we also see decreases in water storage. And so this is, in part due to changes in climates. But another thing Huggins et al. Did was looked at social adaptability in the context of this freshwater stress. And so social adaptability means, how well is the infrastructure constructed in a particular region to compensate for decreases in water storage? That is, can freshwater resources still be collected and distributed even though we're seeing decreases in availability? And so again, these red areas are where we see, sort of severe, what we'll call freshwater basin freshwater status and low adaptability. That means that, there's a lot of water stress in that region, and that region has very limited ability to respond to those stresses. So what I've got here now is a map I made where we've got countries where we've had COVID-19 death rates greater than 100 deaths per 100,000 in the population. And this was through January 21st, 2022. And then the blue squares that I've put on here highlight regions that are identified with moderate to severe water stress and low to moderate social adaptability. And so these are areas where, there's not a lot of water, there's decreasing amounts of water, and the infrastructure doesn't allow the community to really respond to that stress. So water distribution is challenged and access to water is challenged. And so, we're seeing areas of Mexico, a few areas in South America, over Afghanistan, Iran, the Middle East, parts of Europe, South Africa. So all areas where climate change and likely impacted the amount of water that's available, which then has a cascading effect of decreasing the community's ability to respond to COVID. And so if we look at what the lack of access to WASH looked like before COVID-19, and WASH just refers to water, sanitation, and hygiene. So access to WASH is critical to mitigating the effects of COVID spread, because it allows people to effectively wash their hands, clean their house, clean their dishes. But data from before the pandemic, from over 8,000 households from 29 sites across North America, South America, Africa, Middle East, and Asia, indicated that 46% of households in this data set lack the ability to regularly wash their hands or even get water from outside the household. So, that's a huge number. And I think it's a number that we don't really recognize in developed countries, or more developed countries and developed regions. I shouldn't say countries, but regions. And so, that was our starting point when COVID hit. And that starting point in many ways is due to changes in climate, which has decreased the amount of available water. So let's go into a few examples and talk about access to sanitation during the pandemic in focus on Africa. So in a study of 25 sub-Saharan African countries during the pandemic, again, approximately 46% of the households did not have in-house access to water or a sanitation facility. And in 5 of these countries, less than 2% of the households had access to these resources. So this lack of in-house clean water, including soap for hand washing, again, really limits the ability to, or hinders the ability to limit the spread of COVID-19. And you can't wash your hands, you can't really clean things so well. But an additional aspect that I think people don't recognize as well is that if you don't have access to water in your house, you have to travel to water sources. And so these are points of congregation in the community. And you may have hundreds of people lining up at a water resource to get their water, which serves as a transmission point for COVID. And so, one thing to consider is that we've got, maybe 3 million people that live in water-stressed areas in sub-Saharan Africa. And again, it's important to remember that many of these people would view COVID-19 preventive recommendations, frequent hand washing and sanitation as a luxury. And so, we're thinking about COVID, but we really need to think about the impact of climate on water resources and the cascading effect that this has on varying social and economic systems around the globe. And Africa is really one of the places that has been hardest hit in this regard. And so now I want to move to Brazil and talk about the impacts or the relationship between water and COVID. And this is not necessarily climate change related, but it serves as an example of how indigenous people really tend to be more susceptible to the nexus of water and COVID. And you can imagine how climate might further exacerbate this problem. And so Brazil has had the third highest number of COVID cases and the second highest number of reported COVID deaths in the world. And so most of the Amazon River basin is contained within the borders of Brazil, and access to water, is really not a significant problem here. But access to basic sanitation is an issue within the Amazon basin. And so this is a particular concern because COVID-19 can be shed in feces from humans for at least 2 days after the virus is no longer in the respiratory tract. So we've got untreated wastewater serving as an important vector for COVID-19. There are thousands of communities located near the Amazon River, which include, maybe approximately 180 native groups and an estimated 306,000 indigenous people. So, you've got this combination of indigenous livelihoods, people that lack developed sanitation systems, and this global pandemic really representing one of the many facets of the challenges presented by COVID-19 and the need for place-based approaches to develop effective water resources infrastructure. So the next thing I want to do, though, is move on to India to talk about some tend to be mixed outcomes. So India has had the second highest number of reported COVID cases and third highest number of reported deaths in the world. So in India, reduced human activities associated with the pandemic have actually contributed to water quality improvements in rural regions, yet urban areas really haven't experienced these same improvements. And so the increase in water demand, presumably related to increased attention to personal hygiene, has resulted in about a 25% increase in water consumption in some areas. However, within these changes, the contribution of municipal wastewater to water pollution has increased from about 23% to 50%, because people are locked down and staying in their houses. So we've got sort of a fairly complex response to COVID. But, the thing to remember is that, people are using more water resources to improve sanitation. But at the same time, India is probably one of the most water-stressed regions in the world and is experiencing intense droughts due to climate change. So they're using more water, but they're stressing their systems even more during COVID to try and compensate for the needs to maintain, quality water access and sanitation and hygiene. So it's kind of from an academic perspective, it's an interesting and complicated situation, and sort of, to me, really represents the complexity of the whole system. So, beyond these direct effects, we can think of second order effects of the pandemic. So first order impacts are things that are really associated with the immediate response to the pandemic. So tracking a number of deaths in cases, testing, access to hospitals, how essential workers are impacted. But second order impacts are the results of actions and policies in response to the spread of the virus. And so, I mean, really, second order impacts can be largely related to things like lockdowns, okay? And so when we have lockdowns, it alters the way that people interact with the environment. And in many regions, this interaction is through acquisition of food and through fisheries, through freshwater resources. So, what we're seeing is that, we know that fisheries are a common and important way that people interact with freshwater biodiversity. And, the fisheries play an important role in addressing several of the sustainable development goals of the United Nations. As with many aspects of the COVID-19 pandemic, the interactions between altered human activities and fisheries, really seems to vary based on regional, social, and environmental conditions. But according to a global survey of fisheries managers, increases in local fishing pressure have been expected or are expected in Southeastern Asia, in Eastern Africa, basically because people are not able to access other food resources and need to go out and collect their own protein. Also they don't have the financial resources. So high unemployment rates are resulting in increases in the need for local fisheries to provide subsistence. In terms of really, specific local impacts, evidence of the impacts of the pandemic on fisheries and consumption are starting to appear. So in Kenya, residents around Lake Victoria, which is an example of a fishery you see on the slide here, are experiencing or have been experiencing, high fish prices, and as a result, consuming less fish. And so the high prices are likely because of reduced fishing and trading activities due to concerns about being infected with COVID-19. During early 2020, as lockdowns and social restrictions were being implemented in Kenya, the region experienced extremely heavy rainfall and flooding. And again, this is likely in part due to the effects of climate change. You've got this apparent interaction between pandemic-altered social activity and climate change, which has had complex effects on local fisheries and fish consumption because, you've got this flooding. People aren't able to go out and catch fish. There's less fish available to the consumer and prices increase. It's just, trying to understand these second order impacts, you start getting into these multiple interacting social, factors with social systems that really reveals the complexity of the situation. In India, the catch, supply, and demand for fish has decreased. Fish harvests were reduced by 44% during the lockdown periods. Prices increased by 40% relative to previous years. Finally, another example is Bangladesh, where we see altered social activities related to the pandemic, altered the supply and trade of fishes, and disrupted the fish farming season. And so what happens now in Bangladesh is yet to be seen, because we had this one season where effectively fish farming was in many areas terminated. And so there's going to be this long-term impact where the community is going to expect production from these fish farms, but it's not going to come because during COVID lockdowns, the farms were essentially shut down. So, just to try and wrap things up, the question then is, if we come back to the first slide, is climate change a threat multiplier? Well, evidence suggests that climate change likely intensified the impacts of COVID-19. So how was that? So climate change contributed to intense droughts and flooding. These intense droughts and flooding challenged access to clean water for sanitation and hygiene, and it also impacted fisheries. And so we haven't seen direct social or political instability related to the COVID-19 impacts on broad scales. But I think the short term of the pandemic and its interactions with changes in climate certainly support the notion that climate change can disrupt these social systems, lead to instability, which we know in the long term can lead to political instability. So, increases in disease, decreases in access to food, decreases security. So is climate change a threat multiplier in the context of COVID? I don't think there's a definitive yes to it, but I think that the model that we're seeing during the past 2 years certainly supports the idea that climate change is a threat multiplier. So with that, I'd just like to wrap up. And for acknowledgements, I'd like to thank Dr. Melinda Laitouri from Harvard, Dr. Robert Richardson from Michigan State, Dr. Junhwan Kim from Harvard, and Dr. Laura Klein from the U.S. Department of State, all of which who were responsible for a book on second-order impacts of the COVID pandemic, of which the work I talked about today was a contribution I made to that book. So I appreciate their support. I also appreciate the Water Institute for, supporting everybody getting together, on World Water Day and during such an important, or covering such an important topic of global importance. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to email me. And again, I really appreciate everybody's attention and hope you enjoy the rest of the summit. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Knouft. I hope everyone enjoyed that presentation. I know I certainly learned some things, so very happy to hear from him. This will lead us into our lunch break. So please go ahead, take a few minutes to grab some food, step away from the computer. The lounge will stay open. So if you want to continue networking or meet up with anyone at any of those tables in the networking lounge, please feel free to do so. I will also add that if you want to enter into a raffle to win a prize of some exciting SLU Water Institute merchandise, you can do that by liking or following one of our social media accounts, and I will put those in the chat here shortly, and using the hashtag SLU Water Summit 2022. So I'll put all of that into the chat, and please go ahead and engage with us on social media for a chance to win some prizes. And with that, I will leave you for lunch, and we will be back at 1 o'clock with our next panel that has to do with artificial intelligence at the intersection of water and climate change. Thanks again for being here with us today, and we will see you soon.